40 years I kept the third stall past the fish gate at Kessa Market, mending torn sails and split boot leather, and the seams of coats too good to throw away. And in 40 years, I do not think more than a dozen people troubled themselves to learn my name. That is not a complaint. A woman who is beneath notice can hear a great deal, and I had heard most of what mattered in that market since before half the stallholders were born. I knew whose son owed whose daughter a debt of grain, who had once smuggled a crate of medicine past the toll gate for a friend, who had buried a sister without telling the priests why. 40 years of thread and quiet made me the market's memory, whether anyone thanked me for it or not. She came to me on a gray morning in the last week of harvest, folded into the bolts of undyed wool behind my counter, like she'd poured herself there. Small, gray-skinned, the color of river stone, with hair the silver white of frost on a rail, and eyes too large and too old for the rest of her. She did not cry, she did not speak. She watched me the way a creature watches a trap it has already decided to walk into anyway, because the alternative is worse. I did not ask where she'd come from. The smoke on the wind from the border road that week had told most of that story already. A village put to the torch by men who wanted the road clear and didn't care what walked it first. I gave her a heel of yesterday's stew, warmed on my little stove, and a length of my own mending thread, blue as a vein, which I tied loose around her wrist because she would not let go of my sleeve otherwise. She did not thank me. She only stopped watching the gate for a while and slept sitting up, and that was thanks enough for a woman my age. I called her Wick because she took to flame and stayed lit once she caught, and because I was too old to waste breath guessing at a name in a tongue I didn't speak. She never corrected me, so I kept it. She was not an easy child to keep, that first night. She would not lie flat, only sat with her back against the stall's canvas wall and her knees drawn up, watching the lane through the gap where the awning didn't quite meet the post. When a cartwheel struck a stone somewhere out in the dark, she went rigid all over, and it took the better part of an hour of my hands moving slow and visible over my mending, nothing sudden, nothing reaching, before her shoulders came down from around her ears. I have raised no children of my own. I have only ever kept a stall and a ledger of who owed what to whom, but I have handled frightened animals enough times, mending harness for men who didn't know how to gentle a horse, to know that the worst thing you can do to something that has just watched its world burn is to ask it to trust you before it's ready. So I didn't ask. I only kept my hands moving and let the stove throw its small orange light across the both of us, and eventually she slept. 3 days I hid her plainly, in the way that works best, not hidden at all, just folded into the ordinary traffic of an old woman's stall, sorting scraps, handing me pins, invisible, because children who help their grandmothers mend are the least interesting thing in any market on any world. It might have held, but on the fourth morning, Dansk Wreath came through the fish gate at the head of 6 soldiers wearing the rival houses gray and silver, and Dansk Wreath had never in 10 years forgotten that I once refused to alter his captain's coat to hide a stolen medal, and he had never forgiven the refusal, small as it was. He knew my face before he knew why he was looking for it. That was the trouble with a man like Wreath. His hate ran ahead of his orders and arrived first. "Still stitching other people's cast-offs, Voss," he said, standing over my stall the way young officers stand over old women, expecting the height to matter. "We're looking for a border stray, gray skin, silver hair. Say nothing and I'll assume you know nothing." I told him I minded my thread and not the border. It was even partly true, but his eyes had already gone past me to the wool bolts, and I understood then that I had perhaps one day, no more, before he came back with orders instead of grudges. So I spent what 40 years had bought me. I sent Wick down the covered lane in a basket of undyed cloth, carried by a boy who owed his mother's stall a debt I'd once quietly settled for her. I sent word ahead by the fishmonger's girl, whose father I'd fed through a hard winter, without ever mentioning it since. By dusk, Wick had slept in 3 different stalls and eaten from 4 different hands, and not one of those people asked me why, because I had spent decades making sure that when I asked for something, the asking was the whole explanation. That is a debt too. It only doesn't feel like one while you're paying it forward instead of back. Reith searched for 2 more days, the longest I'd spent since I was young enough for days to feel long. His men turned over cart beds and asked children's names twice, as if a lie might crack on the second telling. I kept mending. I kept my hands slow and visible, the way I'd learned to keep them for Wick. Because a market, watching an old woman thread a needle, is a market that has stopped watching anywhere else. Word came back to me in scraps, the way it always does in that lane. Wick had eaten dumplings at the noodle cart and not spoken a word, which the wife there took, correctly, as instruction to say nothing herself. She had slept an afternoon behind the spice stall under a tarp that smelled strong enough to cover whatever else she smelled of. She had, at one point, mended a small tear in her own sleeve, with a needle someone had pressed into her hand without a word, which told me more about how she'd grow up than anything I could have asked her outright. He grew uglier with each of those 2 days, the way men do when a market of nobodies keeps handing him nothing. On the 3rd evening he found me anyway, because he was patient in the way that hate makes a man patient, and because eventually the basket had to come back to my stall, and eventually it did, with Wick asleep inside it, worn thin with hiding. He stood over the basket a long moment. Then he crouched. I will say that for him, he did not loom, whatever else he was, and reached toward her, and she woke and did not flinch, only watched him the same steady way she'd watched me on the first morning, deciding. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," he told me, not looking up. "I've made it exactly as hard as it needed to be," I said. "You'll want to hear the rest of it before you take her anywhere." He did look up then. I had never once, in 10 years, given him a reason to think I had anything worth listening to. That was the whole of my advantage, and I spent it in a single sentence. "Your captain's coat," I said, "the one I wouldn't alter. I kept the tailor's ledger from that season. Every commission, every seal, every date, including the one your house paid to have cut the week your border patrol burned Ansell's cross and called it bandits. I've had 10 years to decide who else in this market ought to see that ledger. I've decided it's everyone standing within earshot right now." The lane had gone quiet in the particular way a market goes quiet when it senses something is finally, after years, coming due. Every stallholder within 20 paces owed me something they'd forgotten they owed, and every one of them was watching Reith with the flat, patient attention of people who have just realized the invisible old woman was never keeping accounts for her own sake. He looked at all of them. He looked at me. Then, slowly, the way a man does when he understands a fight is already over, and the only thing left to decide is how much dignity he keeps on the way out. He stood, and straightened his coat, and told his men to fall back to the gate. He did not apologize. Men like Reith never do. But he did not come back, and 3 weeks later, word came down the border road that his house had recalled him for a different posting, quietly, the way houses do when they'd rather not explain themselves. Wick stayed. I never did learn her true name, and she never offered it, and I stopped expecting her to. I gave her the 3rd stall's 2nd stool instead, and taught her the needle, and she is, 12 years on, better at it than I ever was, though she still ties a scrap of blue thread around her wrist most mornings, before she opens the shutters, out of habit or memory. I've never asked which. They will tell you, if you ask around Kessa Market, that nobody remembers old Voss's given name either. That much is true, and I've made my peace with it. Let them forget mine. I spent 40 years making sure they'd never forget hers.